Welcome to Ask An Atheist. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and this is the second of our new participatory program, Ask an Atheist, where you can participate.
And it doesn't matter if you call yourself an unabashed atheist or an indifferent agnostic or a believer who's just curious. I'm Dan Barker. I'm FFRF co-president and, by the way, a former evangelical minister who saw the light.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, an atheist and a constitutional attorney here with FFRF.
And in every week of this program, look for us at the same time, same place. Staff from the Freedom from Religion Foundation will tackle a controversial or thought-provoking or topical subject.
And it usually has something to do with free thought or the separation between state and church. Last week, we explained what's wrong with the Ten Commandments, and there's a lot wrong with the Ten Commandments. Today, we're going to talk about a persistent but unsupported criticism of FFRF, something we hear from the right wing to make us appear exclusively anti-Christian and biased. We hear it from the likes of The Blaze or Todd Starnes, who asks, why doesn't FFRF go after Muslims who violate the First Amendment?
And of course, we at FFRF don't actually go after anyone of any religion. We go after violations of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to our godless Constitution. We work to uphold a valued constitutional principle. So FFRF is not anti-Christian. FFRF is pro-state-church separation. We are anti-Christianity in government or Islam in government, and we'll pursue any legitimate state-church violation, regardless of which religion happens it to be encroaching upon our Constitution.
Put another way, FFRF is equal opportunity when it comes to battling religion. We are the watchers on the wall, Jefferson's wall of separation between state and church. We've tackled violations by Jewish groups, Buddhists, Muslims, and of course, Christians. In fact, I've actually written legal letters on violations involving all these different religions, from Buddhist shrines on public properties to ritual Jewish circumcision, where the mohel actually sucks the blood from the cut foreskin. This happens in New York City today, often giving the infant herpes. We've even stopped the government from preferring religion generally over non-religion. Just last week, I wrote Orange County, Florida, a letter explaining that when the government endorses multiple religions over non-religion, such as by organizing a Christian, Jewish, and Muslim prayer, which actually happened, that is still a constitutional violation. The government must be neutral on matters of religion.
So, why doesn't FFRF go after state-church separation problems involving Islam? The answer is simple. We do. A recent example happening right now is in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, where the Board of County Commissioners declared May 26th to June 24th as the month of Ramadan. Ramadan, of course, is the Islamic holy month, marked by fasting to celebrate the first time Allah supposedly spoke to Muhammad. Mecklenburg's resolution talks about drawing closer to God, about the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, and even about the existence of a soul. The resolution did not explain that these are merely beliefs of those who celebrate the holiday. Our secular government must scrupulously avoid making a declaration about the veracity of religious beliefs. So, FFRF wrote a letter educating the county, asking them to refrain from such violations in the future. That is a complaint about Islam that we made about the same time that The Blaze was again asking us, why don't we go after Islam?
So The Blaze was upset about a comment that I made, and it was about a New York public school accommodating the religious beliefs of some students. And I was asked to weigh in when the principal at a high school in Clinton Park, New York, reserved a room where Muslim students could briefly go throughout the day during the month of Ramadan. The principal identified this as an accommodation. He pointed out it was student initiated. He noted it did not interfere with educational activities and that reserving the rooms didn't displace students or educational activities. Without this public accommodation, there would have been Muslim students who would have missed school for many days in a row. I pointed out that there were problems with this that the principals had to monitor that paraphernalia should not be left in the classrooms. It shouldn't be called a prayer room, for example. And I also told them, I don't really like this, but this is new public accommodation law that has evolved in my lifetime. But like JFK, I really believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. But since this accommodation law is here to stay, this seemed like the very best the schools could do. And we also pointed out that if there's more damning facts that come to light showing entanglement or endorsement, we'll reassess.
So there are two basic reasons why it may seem like we don't address violations of Islam. The first is demographics. The US Muslim population is 1%, while Christians are at more than 70%. There are just fewer Muslim violators out there. But it's not just a question of the numbers. Our government is structured so that majority rules on certain issues. So it is the majority that will usually violate the rights of the minority. This is precisely why we have a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights exists to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. So the democratic process, coupled with demographics, automatically checks most of the Islamic State church violations that we see.
And there's a second reason why you don't hear much about these violations. It's because they often don't fit the media narratives. For example, when FFRF challenged a Muslim college professor who was promoting his personal religion in the public classroom, we sent our press release to Fox News. We sent it all over the country, complete with audio clips and PowerPoint slides showing the violation. Here's one that reads, "Logical inference confirms the existence of God." Well, of course it doesn't. That's a factual statement about a religious belief that is untrue and is being taught in a public school classroom. So FFRF successfully fought this religious endorsement, but our action didn't fit the right-wing media narrative of atheists targeting only Christians. So despite tons of evidence, audio and visuals and more, you never heard about it.
But Dan, you've had public debates with Muslims, correct?
Well, with several Muslim apologists and Muslim scholars over the years. In fact, I've done 9 public debates with Islamic scholars. They're kind of similar apologetically to the Christian theologians. I did one in 2003. I debated Hassanein Rajabali at the Islamic Center in Queens, New York. And then I've debated Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan, in Minneapolis, and a few times in London, publicly challenging the irrationality of the Quran and the dangers of Islamic dogma.
So the Freedom from Religion Foundation has given prominent critics of Islam such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Taslim Najran awards for their intellect and bravery. FFRS related charity, Non-Belief Relief, of which I'm particularly proud, has given tens of thousands of dollars to help relocate non-religious Bangladeshi bloggers who've been on a hit list for daring to challenge Islam. We're helping an endangered Iraqi woman right now.
The simple fact is that our position differs from the right-wingers who accuse us of hypocrisy for not taking on Islam. It's different because it's intellectually honest and logically consistent, because it lacks the cognitive dissonance required of religion. We shudder at the prospect of one nation under God as much as we would if it were one nation under Allah. We fight for our secular government and our godless constitution, not the arrogant and unreasonable position that the government should favor one particular imaginary being over another. We believe a secular government is the only path to peace and true religious liberty, and that means our government may not endorse or promote any religion.
And FFRF, of course, actually has 2 purposes. We work to keep state and church separate, as the Constitution demands. We also work to educate the public about matters of non-theism. And as part of that second purpose, we have never, ever shied away from criticizing religion, and that includes Islam.
Well, especially in the wake of terror attacks conducted by Islamists, the Islamic theocrats, motivated by Islamic holy texts. Unlike many believers who offer thoughts and prayers to victims, We point out that religion itself is the problem. We need less religion, not more, and that includes Christianity as well as Islam. And by the way, instead of offering prayers, FFRF's non-belief relief gave $10,000 to the Human Compassion Fund, which handed over the money directly to the victims and surviving families of the massacre in The Pulse in Orlando, Florida, which, by the way, happened a year ago this week.
And FFRF also differs with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has done great work. But unfortunately, they have added Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a heroine of the first class, to their list of anti-Muslim extremists for criticizing Islam, not for making bigoted statements against Muslims. None of Ayaan's statements quoted by the Law Center were against Muslims. They were legitimate criticisms of Islam. And if anyone had reason to be an Islamophobe, and I'm not using that label, it would be someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who who faces the threat daily of harassment and death by Islamist extremists. It's part of her daily existence. Yet she has not hesitated to speak out publicly as an infidel, as she calls herself, an atheist, as an international critic of the Muslim treatment of women. And importantly, there is a distinction between ideas and people.
And that distinction is critical. Ideas can and should be criticized. Scrutinizing and criticizing ideas is the very basis of freedom of thought, our most cherished freedom. Religion is nothing more than a set of ideas, bad ideas, that can and should be exposed. But we should distinguish between ideas and the people who believe in them. Painting all Muslims as terrorists is counterproductive and factually wrong. Saying that Islam contains bad ideas and that those bad ideas can motivate and justify violent action is a plain fact. The difference between people and the ideas they hold is critical because people can change their mind. All it takes for a believer to become an atheist is for them to change their mind about one belief. And as Thomas Paine said, the mind once enlightened cannot again become dark.
And so I think on that very bright note, let's get to your questions. And the first question is a video submission from a friend of FFRF and a complainant whom we've helped with a discrimination issue, Muhammad Sayed, president of Ex-Muslims of North America.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Sayed. I'm the president of Ex-Muslims of North America. We're a nonprofit dedicated to the needs of ex-Muslims. We work to erase the apostasy stigma and normalize dissent with the Muslim communities. We also help ex-Muslims by building communities around the United States and Canada. My question to Dan and Annie is, do you see any significant differences between Islam and Christianity in regards to how they breach the separation of church and state?
Well, that is a broad topic, and we don't get that many, as Andrew explained, we don't get that many complaints about the Muslim religion. They're usually about school accommodation.
Well,
it's
like
just a handful.
the washing hands fountains that some schools put into the schools to accommodate Muslim students who need to do that every day.
Yes, and also we've had some complaints over the years about in the Twin Cities about accommodations for that at airports, for example.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is we actually get a lot of complaints that are not legitimate. Right, we get a lot of complaints that are they're basically right-wing trolling. They're not real state church issues. I think there are significant state church issues, but most of them come from Christian encroachments for the reasons that we already said. Internationally, I think it's definitely a different scenario.
Yes.
I mean, we've been seeing blasphemy laws. They've been all over the news lately. This is a huge problem, and it tends to be a problem in Islamic countries more.
And I think that as the Muslim population grows, I think we'll be seeing more conflicts, and we'd be better able to answer that question. But the vast preponderance of state church complaints that come into the Freedom from Religion Foundation, of course, are about the dominant religion in our country, which is Christianity.
Well, because in this country, like you point out, Islam is a minority. Remember back more than a century ago when Catholicism was a tiny minority, they had to kind of keep their heads down. They were the minority that were being protected from the tyranny of the majority by the First Amendment. And so many lawsuits were taken by Catholics back then. But
that
later,
were protective of separation of
which
church
were
and
actually very
state.
good. But then later, when Catholicism became huger, it kind of flipped. And now they don't need that protection as much, and they're more violators now. So
And they want us to fund Catholic schools, and they want to ban birth control. So we are fighting that.
So that's why we see Muslims more often keeping their heads down in this country while they are small. But let's not give them too much rope.
Usually minorities are very supportive of the separation of church and state.
Historically,
We
that is
understand it
absolutely
protects
true.
us.
One of the cases we did work on was we helped Muhammad's group get a cake baked.
That's right.
They were trying to get a cake to celebrate their second anniversary, and the Wegmans grocery store, a baker there refused to bake a cake for ex-Muslims.
And do you remember the reason why?
Yeah, well, they were apostates, basically.
Well, because they had some Muslim workers.
Yes, it was Muslim workers in the bakery that protested and said, we aren't going to make this, which of course that violates the civil rights of the ex-Muslims of North America. So I wrote a letter, and to their credit, Wegmans grocery store acted very quickly and corrected the violation and did absolutely the right thing, and they got their cake.
I think they should have given it to them for free, but they did do it. And do you want to explain the Civil Rights Act briefly,
Sure.
why that is a violation?
Sure. So the Civil Rights Act prevents people from being discriminated against in places of a public accommodation on the basis of their religion, among a few other things. And refusing to provide service to somebody because they are no longer a Muslim is absolutely religious discrimination, as is charging them more because they are an ex-Muslim, or because they are not Christian, or because they're not Jewish, something along those lines.
Or because they are Christian or Jewish. I mean,
Correct.
it applies equally.
Absolutely.
So you can have your cake and eat it too in this country.
Even if you're an ex-Muslim.
Even
Yes.
if you're a former Muslim.
Yes.
So, and I think, was that your victory?
Yes.
Yes, congratulations. And that made a...
It was a pleasure to help. I mean, they're a great group. They do great work. So, and I think we have another question. I think we have one from Facebook or from Twitter now, and this one is from Mitch Withers. He says, should the government ban certain religious attire, like the burqa? Should they ban other practices? And then how does the government protect oppressed without infringing on religious freedom? So
other practices that have the overall effect of subjugating women is part of that question. And this is a very thorny issue, and I feel very strongly, I understand why France banned the burqa. I very much disagreed with banning the burkini, and I think that they have retrenched on, because it's the perfect way to enslave somebody. It's the perfect way to bring a terrorist in the country or at an airport. I mean, if you're shrouded and you have no identity, how does anybody know who they're dealing with? And we did have one case here in the United States, and I'm sorry I didn't look up in advance about the final verdict on that, but a Baptist woman converted to the Muslim religion, and then she said that she wanted to have her burqa on her driver's license. Now this is carrying things to ridiculous extremes, because the purpose of a driver's license is so you can identify who someone is, and that to me is absurd.
it's a bit useless to have a personal ID card that doesn't have your face on it.
And also, I think back to Elizabeth Smart, the little Mormon girl that was abducted. She was walking around in front of people who knew her on the streets with her abductor because he had enshrouded her. So there are real criminal and identity issues with a burqa, and it's also a symbol of subjugation for women. And so with the French laïcité concept, they felt that it was also demeaning to all French women, and that these women, Muslim women who were coming into the country, were being denied their civil rights rather than being deprived of their civil rights because they wanted to wear a burqa. I think it's very different. The headscarf issue is completely different, but when your identity is actually enshrouded, this is a major problem.
But in our country, isn't the general principle that our secular government can impose some limits if they have a secular purpose? If there's a public interest or a good purpose, you can stop religious parents from denying medical treatment to their children.
Supposedly.
The state can step in and take over and override what they say are their religious views if there is a good secular purpose for it. And the driver's license is one good example. It's not like the government is persecuting religion. There's a general secular reason for it.
On the other hand, people may wear ski masks that are partly of hiding their identity, wrap up with scarves in the cold. I mean, it's hard to know where to draw the line.
But not on their driver's license. They wouldn't
No,
put
not on their driver's
Sure.
license. How
So-
ridiculous.
So it's basically a balancing act. If there is a legitimate secular purpose to say, no, you can't wear this into a bank, for instance, or through customs and immigration services, or to get your driver's license photo, then yes. But then
Or-
we also balance that against.
What about a girl going to a public school and she's totally enshrouded? I mean, I can see how that would be very disruptive.
And you might not even know it's her.
Yeah.
But you have to balance that then against the First Amendment rights also. You know, one of my favorite cases is Cohen versus California, where the Supreme Court upheld the right of a 19-year-old to wear a jacket that said "fuck the draft" into a county courthouse. And in it, the majority wrote that one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. It's just kind of one of the famous Supreme Court lines. But so you do have a First Amendment right to wear what you want, but there also are these very serious issues.
And it may be that the woman doesn't want to wear the burqa, and this is a symbol that's demeaning to women,
And so-
whether she embraces her chains or not. That there is a feminist issue there, and I have had the horrible experience of trying on a burqa, being given one by an ex-Muslim woman who let women try it on, and it was very claustrophobic,
Oh, I'd imagine.
frightening, and it really does completely take away the identity of women. They just become objects and things on the street that you don't notice. They have no identity anymore. So it's a very distressing a way to subjugate women.
I also wonder if there might not be something in terms of putting it into practice that might be counterproductive. Whereas if you say you were to ban the burqas, it seems to me that these women might just be stuck at home then. They might never be able to
Right,
leave.
and that's one of the arguments against it in France. And I don't think that a burqa ban has come up in the United States. I don't think
No.
it's really been an issue.
No, I don't think so either.
This is really where maybe the Afghan women coming into France, this spurred on the debate. So it is a thorny topic, and
During my debate after my debate in Queens, where I debated Hasanain Rajabawi, where I said that I think the main purpose of Islam is the control of access to females. And look how these women are dressing. These are male property, and these men think they own it and they can cover it. After the debate, some angry Muslim women came up to me and said, "How dare you tell us what we can and can't wear? We are choosing to wear these scarves. We are choosing to honor our faith and our husbands by dressing like this. It's not because we feel oppressed. We are proud to dress like Muslims."
well, and again, I would say in the United States, there's no question that the headscarves and similar attire are not going to be an issue, but the burqa has some problems.
Yeah. And the burkina is just a little half.
The bikini was,
That's for the beaches.
yeah, and then that ban got out of control.
Yeah.
That just looked like discrimination.
It did. And I think too, there's a certain amount of, it's not you can't ban an idea, right? That's not the way to defeat the idea. The way to defeat an idea is with better ideas and with discourse, I think.
And then
Which is
plus
what we're
these
trying to do
women
here.
wouldn't have been allowed to enjoy the beach and go swimming, and they
Exactly.
weren't hurting anybody. And they weren't actually their faces weren't fully enshrouded. It was just called a bikini. They're,
So I got a good question here from Jeremy Watkins from Facebook. He says, "Do you see any difference in the Islamic law, Sharia law, and our government making laws supporting and enforcing Christian beliefs as laws?" He doesn't see a difference. He thinks that calling this a Christian nation is no different than saying it's an Islamic nation.
Well, I think, yes, Jeremy's got a good point there. And the people who are most concerned about Sharia are usually the religious right, who want to impose Christianity and Bible-based government on the rest of us. And there have been some unconstitutional bills passed in various states saying we can't bring in Sharia law. Well, we don't need those. We have a First Amendment, and the First Amendment
Yeah.
Is
protects
because
us from having religious law.
it's
Absolutely.
because they see it as the competition.
Yeah.
You know, we territorially control this Christian nation, and these outsiders are coming in to try to take over some of our territory. So they're threatened by Sharia law, not seeing. The Bible says you should, before you take the beam out of someone else's eye, you should take the mote out of your own. They're not seeing that they're part of the same problem.
Quoting the Bible back at them, Dan. That's devious. And I mean, for me, I think, Annie Laura, you hit it. We The United States invented the solution to this in 1787. It's called the separation of state and church. If you're worried about Sharia law, support state-church separation. Donate some money to FFRF. We are fighting this by supporting state-church separation. That's the way to beat it.
And then I would add that, of course, we are very worried about Sharia law as it is being forced on women in Islamist nations all around the world. And much of that Sharia law comes from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Testament that is shared in common by the Islamic, Jewish, and Christian religions. These Mosaic laws that we talked about last week, that when you hear about women being stoned to death in Islamist nations because they're not a virgin or because they've been committing adultery, that law is in the Mosaic law, the Mosaic Code, in the Old Testament that Christians supposedly revere.
And there are
So there's commonalities here, it's just not being applied. But of course we're these are barbaric.
There are some modern Christians in America called Reconstructionists who actually do want to go back to the actual Old Testament laws and bring America back to what they think was the true founding of our country.
And maybe some of the rest of you are watching The Handmaid's Tale. It's tonight. I guess it's the series conclusion tonight. And Dan and I have been watching it. I'm wearing the same color by accident. But that's the whole idea of the Christian Reconstructionist, going back to Old Testament law.
But you need to wear that white hat thing so you fit in
I'm
there.
not a handmaid.
A terrifying future. So we have another question. This is from a believer, I think. Quote, separation of church and state is absolute. The separation of church and state is not in our Constitution and not in our Bill of Rights. Why are you insisting on telling people that it is? So this is like one of the most common arguments that we hear, and it's just so lame. Dan, you have a good rebuttal that you like to give, but Annie Laurie, I know you have one too.
Well, it is couched in absolutes. Of course, the First Amendment of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are two clauses. We're talking about the first, and under the under the 14th Amendment, it applies to state citizens. A lot of people don't know that, and they say, oh, it only applies to Congress. And it is couched in an absolute. And Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, of course, was asked by the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, to explain the meaning of the Establishment Clause, and he famously said it erects a wall of separation between church and state, and that is absolute.
And so the idea here is that that's a phrase that represents a constitutional principle. There are other phrases that don't appear in the Constitution, like right to privacy or interstate commerce. These are phrases that the courts have used to refer to certain parts. So the separation of church and state has a long revered history. That phrase is in a lot of court decisions. But if we were to take that phrase away because those exact words don't appear in the founding document, then we should also take out the word Trinity from Christianity, because the word Trinity appears nowhere in the Bible. All these churches, or Christmas, or original sin, or a whole bunch of concepts that Christians talk about all the time. The word Trinity represents a principle that is established by the Christian religion
in the Bible.
In the Bible, although that word doesn't appear there. So there's probably 3 or 4 dozen Christian words that we would have to throw away if we're going to follow this questioner's advice.
Well, I love bringing the war on Christmas to June. I think that it's good that we're doing that. I also, one of my favorites is fair trial. This is absolutely a right that we have.
Fair trial?
Yeah, and it's enshrined in our Constitution, and it's convenient shorthand for several different rights in the Constitution. But this is the phrase that we use to describe it. Same with state-church separation.
It's a metaphor that is descriptive of a constitutional principle.
And it was the first time it was used was by the Supreme Court was actually in 1878 in the Reynolds case. And another thing that I like to point out too is that before the First Amendment was passed, the original Constitution only mentioned religion once, and that was the prohibition on religious tests. No religious tests shall ever be required for any office.
So the references are exclusionary to religion.
Exactly, and it is one of the most emphatic statements in the entire document. If you want to talk about an absolute, no, shall, ever, any. It is about as absolute as the language in the Constitution gets. I mean, it was usually left deliberately vague so that they could build this government, but not there.
And also, my favorite refrain is that we do have a godless Constitution. There's no references to religion in it except exclusionary. And sovereignty is given in we, the people. The founders, the framers of our Constitution were the first in history not to claim a pipeline to a divinity. And think about it, our Constitution is the longest lived Constitution in the world. This has been very successful. If America's going to import anything, I wish it would be this idea, not McDonald's.
And we can connect this to Islam because the treaty with Tripoli had to do with the Islamic ruler of the country or state of Tripoli, the Bay of Tripoli, who was nervous about having a treaty with a supposedly Christian country because there would be this clash. And our founders, it was written under Washington and signed under Adams, wrote a treaty with Tripoli that says the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So don't worry, we're no threat to Islam.
And the Senate unanimously consented to that language. So yes.
What year was that? 1797.
I want to say.
97,
To go back and look.
Google
though.
it.
Yeah, Google that. Don't take our word for that one. So we have another question from Christopher Allen Pugh, and this is not directly on point, but it does relate. Is FFRF going to tackle the religious freedom bill that was just passed in Florida?
Do you want to talk to that?
Absolutely. So first of all, it does relate to Islam a little bit because the bill that was passed, which basically says that kids are allowed to pray in public schools, which has never been a question. What it's actually trying to do is actually trying to encourage kids to pray and to tell teachers and staff that they are allowed to join in that prayer, which is definitely going to lead to some coercion. So first of all, FFRF has done 3 different action alerts on this bill at different times to our members, telling them to oppose it. Our local group, led by David Williamson, actually testified against this bill, and we did put out a statement on it yesterday. But one thing
we put a statement out today.
Today, and
Yeah.
one thing that the sponsors never realize is that Christianity is on the decline in this country, and it is atheism and non-religion and some of the minority religions that are on the rise. So this also fosters Mormon messages and Islamic messages, and hopefully we'll see some atheist messages.
But I think it also fosters division in
Oh,
the schools
absolutely.
because there's nothing more divisive in the schools than religion. And when you say you can pray in school, what we mean by that is, of course, well, there's that old saw. I don't really like it, but you always hear it. As long as there are math tests in school, there'll be prayer in school. But what we're talking about is not public prayer. It's private prayer. It's someone just praying to themselves. It's not disrupting the classroom or, praying before they eat, but it's not forcing other people to pray with them or having the endorsement of the school. It's just private, as it should be.
Absolutely, and I think too, one of the things that we're going to see this bill lead to, we're going to see some bullying. I've already dealt with some serious bullying problems because of religion in the public schools in Florida. And when teachers get involved in the religion of their students, it absolutely becomes worse for those minority students, and we're definitely going to see more of that as a result of this bill, which was pushed by Representative Daniels, who has, she live tweets and has Facebook Live her Christian religion all over her Facebook page. I mean, she does sermons throughout all over her Facebook page, and we've actually been dealing with the Florida Ethics Board about that, so stay tuned for more news on that.
Yeah, and so if there are violations, entanglements from this, we'll be on it.
We are.
I used to pray before math tests, and I found out that God wasn't any smarter than me, so that's one of the lines in one of my songs. So.
But it's very true. Another
Okay.
question?
We do have another question. This one is from Kathleen Sulak, and she's making a counterpoint here. She's saying that setting aside a room in a school for any length of time for the purpose of prayer is using taxpayer funds for religious reasons. So I think she's pushing back on the New York case.
Well, I'm with you really in spirit because about 33 of our state constitutions say nobody shall be compelled to attend, erect, or support a place of worship. But in this case, it's not being called a prayer room. it's a short-term accommodation. Ramadan often doesn't fall during the annual school year, depending on where you live in your school schedule. It's a very minor accommodation. And under accommodation law, under what the Supreme Court has approved, I don't think that we can act on it. And do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah,
on
I don't think it's a violation that we would take action on.
I mean,
if you look,
to elaborate, the Equal Access Act is something that was passed by Congress in the early 90s, and then the Supreme Court approved it. And the FFRF opposed the Accommodation Act, but it's the law of the land. So, and that says that if you have, if you allow students to meet about academic subjects, you have to allow student clubs that are for religion or against religion, or political clubs. And many schools did not allow prayer clubs to meet or Christian clubs, and now they have them, thanks to the Equal Access Act. But there are some stipulations that teachers are not supposed to be involved, and that's where the Florida law is really blurring the line. But with that kind of decision by the Supreme Court, that kind of accommodation law, we have to be realists. And what can we do about it?
But if they had a sign over the room that said prayer room, please be quiet.
Or for Muslim students
Yeah.
only, or they were broadcasting it on the PA system.
Or another thing that we have dealt with before was, I think it was at the University of Iowa, where they were actually setting aside prayer rooms in the university center, and they had it divided up by sex, men only, women only. And so if it were something like that, we would certainly take action too.
And also a public university where there are campus ministries all over the place, I don't know why a prayer room would be needed in a campus setting.
Or churches
This is a
across
little
the
different.
street.
Yeah, like if it was, there are often churches across the street, Mormon churches across the street in the western states from schools taking advantage of the open, that students can be release time law, that students can be released for an hour a week to go visit a church and be indoctrinated. But there's not a mosque across the street from this particular school. So I think that was the issue. But they're not bringing in people. Nobody should really know about it. It should just happen and not have anything to do with the school day. I don't like it, but I don't see that the law can be changed at this point.
I think that's accurate. So we do have one more question, which is actually apt for today. Tom Tinley asks, where does FFRF fall when it comes to teaching the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools with its Under God line? And today is the anniversary of the addition, the day we mourn the addition of Under God to our pledge, 67 years ago, I think, 60-some years ago,
1954.
We'll just say 60-some years ago.
It was 54, yeah.
Well, I remember it. So.
Okay.
Well, when I went to kindergarten, this is ironic, I went to kindergarten at a Christian school, Hawthorne Christian School in California, and we learned the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The law changed that year, and Under God was inserted. I went to first grade then at a public school, and I had to relearn it. One nation, under God, indivisible. And it felt wrong, because the way you first learn it is like the way it naturally sounds. And one nation, indivisible is beautiful. After the Civil War, all the states were fighting. Now we are one nation, indivisible. And then they inserted, the religious right inserted this phrase that divides what is indivisible.
Yeah, they're taking the most divisive concept in history, religion, and dividing the indivisible, absolutely.
And they're also giving the idea that piety, excuse me, is equated with patriotism. It also excludes close to 35% of millennials today who are non-religious. So why should there be an oath that excludes citizens based on religion? That's clearly a religious litmus test for good citizenship. And it's caused untold problems for non-believers and for FFRF because, excuse me, it gives the impression that our nation is founded on a God. And in fact, we have a godless constitution. And at the offices of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we have framed some of the original pledges that used to be in schoolrooms prior to this tampering in 1954 that are godless. And
written by a minister.
Written by a minister, and his family opposed amending the pledge. Mm-hmm. And also, this was something that many religious groups like to claim credit for. Knights of Columbus, there's some Protestant minister who said he had the ear of Ike. And then there's that nefarious family group that holds the annual prayer breakfast in Congress, and they had a great deal to do with it. And it really was a pushback against so-called godless communism, and we have seen so many violations dating to the 1950s because of that. And I feel like I was born in the mid-1950s, and I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to undo many of these violations that were passed in the 1950s. So to that questioner, we are absolutely opposed to the Pledge of Allegiance in schools, and we are often supporting students who are being penalized. They have an absolute right not to sit down. They have an absolute right not to be turned into outcasts, be told to leave the room, but this happens a lot.
It does.
And we have given some student activist awards to some feisty students who have protested that.
I have a question, though. Speaking of
can I
Islam.
jump in? I want to, just to top that real quick, one thing that people might, if you are a Christian and you don't understand our reluctance to say this phrase and you don't get it, just imagine if it said one nation under Allah. Imagine if your child had to get up every single morning, Christian, and say, pledge allegiance to one nation under Allah, and that'll give you a little bit of an idea of what we feel like.
My question relates to that, and I'm not sure I know the answer. Do Muslims in America consider the phrase under God to include under Allah, or do they see that as a Christian God only?
I do not know the answer to that.
We should ask a Muslim how they feel.
We'll
so
have
when
to
they
do that.
say it, when they say one nation under God, are they thinking Allah, or are they thinking the Christian God?
Well, I mean, it is a monotheistic religion.
And it's all
so is
Abrahamic.
Yep, it's all Abrahamic, and so is Judaism. Although Christians believe in 3 gods. It's really not really monotheistic.
There's a really interesting history behind challenging the Pledge of Allegiance, too. This is one of the times the Supreme Court most quickly reversed itself. In 1941, they actually came down with a decision called Go Bitus, where they said that children did have to stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And
it was taken by Jehovah's Witnesses.
It was taken by Jehovah's Witnesses, and they still, after the decision came down, refused to stand. And there was such violence and bullying directed at these poor kids that just a couple years later, in 1943, the Supreme Court changed its mind and said, no, you do have a right to sit out the Pledge of Allegiance if you want to.
And that was even before it was tampered with, so that it was not a godly oath, but Jehovah's Witnesses have a religious objection to taking any kind of oath.
Yeah, this was 1941 for Go Bitus and 1943 for Barnett. So pretty quick turnaround, and also a good thing for us to remember as we're fighting the secular fight, that the Supreme Court can change its mind, and pretty quickly sometimes, on these issues.
And that was a very eloquent language where it said if there's any fixed star in our constellation, it's that the government cannot prescribe orthodoxy in belief or other things.
That is a great paragraph that
Yeah.
we quote often in our letters.
Yes, we do.
And that's another example of a minority religious group feeling persecuted actually creating some good law.
And so we're looking to see, do we have any further questions?
We do, and this is a good one. This is from Jeremy Watkins. What are your thoughts on blasphemy laws? More specifically, the recent death sentence in Pakistan over blasphemy on social media against the Prophet Muhammad. Has there been any similar cases in America?
Well, there were many blasphemy prosecutions in the United States in the 19th century.
Yes.
Robert Ingersoll, the famed orator, agnostic, defended a prominent case.
One of the greatest defenses and attacks on blasphemy laws that I've ever read. This was a New Jersey case in the, I don't remember the year, but it was a gentleman named Reynolds, I believe,
Yeah.
and Ingersoll just took down blasphemy laws in words you've never read. I highly recommend everybody go find it and read it. It's really wonderful.
And also, I think you wrote the FAQ, I might have helped, on blasphemy that
Yep.
we have at our legal website at FFRF.org, and there's under legal, there's a drop down, and there's an FAQ, and there's a whole thing about blasphemy. But in answer to Jeremy's question, of course, this is horrifying, and we are horrified at death sentences or imprisonments for blasphemy, for being an atheist. It's outrageous. We have done an action alert, and we haven't seen other groups do it against the Saudi man that has been sentenced to death, basically for blasphemy, for being an atheist, even though there's some question about his mental health, and even though he's rescinded his statements. It's horrifying that our government would do business with the Saudi government, that they would not respond to our appeal to the State Department to help to save this man's life. this blasphemy sentence in Pakistan, it's terrifying to see how atheists and non-believers and apostates are being treated around the world.
And this is just a way to destroy the freedom of thought. It's a way to end the ability of people to even in their own minds question whether or not this God exists. And blasphemy ideas, as we talked about on the program last week, they admit that the very idea of God is just so weak and fragile that it can't withstand criticism.
Well, because God is all powerful, and don't you dare hurt his feelings.
But also, it's the perfect argument for separation of church and state.
Absolutely.
It isn't the business of a government to care whether their citizens believe in a God or which God or any gods. It's that first commandment being used by a government to put people to death. And this is one of the reasons why we have fought so hard against the Ten Commandments in public places in the United States. I mean, this is a life and death issue in many parts of the world, where religion is part of the government.
And I would take the First Amendment over the First Commandment any day, and twice on the Sabbath. Now, I think that does it for our questions for today. Oh, wait, no, we do have one more. Okay, what are your thoughts on the teachers being given a directive to have students recite the pledge? Can they be fired if they defy the directive? So I think he's talking about, This is Emily McFarland asking about teachers telling their students to go ahead and stand for the pledge. We can revisit that, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think the other issue is what about the rights of teachers who don't want to be involved in the pledge? And that would be something that is potentially could be litigated depending on what appeals district we're looking at. Because teachers' rights haven't really been established. But they do not have the right to force a child to participate or stigmatize them or force them to stand. That
is something that we've actually seen happen many times, sadly. We've seen teachers chastise students for refusing to stand for the pledge. We've seen them make fun of students in front of their peers. And this is one of the ways that we can show religion is so divisive. And it's one of the reasons that the founders chose to separate state and church in the first place.
So here for a separation of church and state.
Absolutely. So I think that does it for our questions. But if people want to submit questions, you guys can submit your questions online. We actually have a email address that you can send them to. If you have a video question, we might put it on the air. We'll be announcing our future topics on Facebook later this week. So please send in your questions and we'll be happy to answer them.
And thank you for listening. Thank you for participating.
So tune in next week, same time, same channel, for another edition of Ask an Atheist. And in the meantime, maybe join FFRF. We could use the support.